Hello and welcome. You're listening to Adventures in the Vale, an RPG discussion podcast. I'm Jake.
I'm Ross.
Sit back and relax by the fire, for there are tales to be told.
Hello, travelers. Welcome to the Cozy Crow. Come and sit by our fire. May I get you something to drink?
Yeah, I'll take an L.
I'll have that right out.
Well, here we are again, the Cozy Crow Tavern. Welcome back. I'm Ross McClure, also known as Mythic Mountains RPG. Once again, I'm joined by my friend Jake.
Hello, I'm Jake, as I usually am.
Usually.
Yep. Actually, the chicken dumplings are really good. I recommend if you come in, you get the chicken dumplings.
You're making me so hungry, but I don't have enough gold.
I mean, maybe you just need to kill that troll that you've been talking about.
Don't judge me. So, trolls. Trolls. About those trolls.
Yeah,
What
about
is a
those
troll?
trolls. What is a troll? That's what we're talking about tonight, right?
Yes. Why trolls? Or anything? Why would you pick what you would pick? Where do you put it? What are we even talking about? We're talking about monsters. What is a monster? Is everything not a player character in the game a monster? What do you do with them? What's the purpose of them? And so I guess that's the first thing is what is a monster?
Yeah, to me, a monster is best simplified by being nothing more than a question. So a monster can be a lot of things. It can be a philosophy. It can be
Mr. Miyagi stuff going on right there.
Okay, so I know it sounds really dumb, but it's actually
A monster.
A monster.
Question.
It sounds dumb, but I'm serious. So the question could be, will the player character survive? The question can be, are the player characters compassionate? The question can be, are they quick-witted? Are they reflexive? Like all these different questions. Whatever your question is, like, I think that's what a monster is, right? Are they brave? If you're fighting a dragon, you have to be brave to fight a dragon, right? If you're going to fight like the mustache-twirling elf king who literally has a thrall of an army like at his side, maybe you have to be like just clever to defeat him. That's how I think of a monster, is as I actually start with the situation and the question that the monster poses.
Okay, that's really deep. Okay, but let me pick it apart.
Okay, I'm good
so let me read. So I heard you say a monster is a question, but like a monster is a question about the characters or the adventure or both. And the example you gave is that if the monster in question is a dragon, it is a question about courage, because a dragon is like this primordial thing of fear and terror for which a hero must face. And that's like the archetype of the dragon. So if the monster is a dragon, then the heroes / character / adventure, that's about facing something. It's about fear. And Justin Alexander just came out with his book, right? So You Want to Be a Game Master. In the beginning, he sort of has this presumption, like, you know what? Dungeons and Dragons. That's probably where you're starting, so let's talk there. And a lot of times when we talk about things, we're kind of assuming perhaps they're coming from the internet and they're wanting to get into tabletop RPGs, or they're starting with like Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and they're looking at other games. So we're talking about that. So why don't we kind of frame it in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So in Dungeons and Dragons, last time we chatted, we talked about how do you prepare? What do you even do if you're a dungeon master? So you're not going to go very far, especially when we gave the example of, hey, have some goblins in a cave, there's this presumption, oh, Dungeons and Dragons, there's the dragon in the dungeon, or in the example I gave, the goblins. So I think a starting point would be, what even is that? You know, to like, what's that about? What is a why? Why would you have goblins in a cave? What are you? Why are you putting a fictional character there? What's its purpose?
Yeah, I mean, that to me defines your game, right? That to me, I always make the question fuel the encounter, and like this creature exists to ask this question, and that question informs everything else about the encounter. Goblins to me are these things of chaos, these little fungal people, and the things that they care about are alien to humans and what humans care about. And they basically only worry about eating and not being eaten. And it's a very different mindset than what people think about. Even if a human were stranded in the woods, I don't know if they would necessarily only think about eating and being worried about being eaten, as humans think about all various of things almost at all times. So to me, like, a goblin is a very primal example of, like, what does it look like when you basically give a woodland creature sentience, and like what does it look like when they have like this ability to communicate clearly and make some type of culture, but also be goblins, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, in Dungeons and Dragons, you could have all kinds of other elements, right? Like you could have tricks, traps, treasure. You could have puzzles, riddles. You could have environmental hazards. But for some reason, like it's a major part of this game is like personifying antagonism. Like there's going to be a personification of an opposition, a question, and that's kind of cool. You're like, this personification, this living being is going to ask you a question about yourself. Are you tough? Are you smart? Are you clever? You know, because so you said like goblins are like chaos. A lot of times goblins are an example of a creature that you have like a low-level adventure with, and they could be unpredictable, but in the end, maybe violent. Like that, you know, like you'll come into violent contact with them, so you either have to evade them or fight them. But what if instead it's like pixies or some sort of fairy creature? We just had an adventure where there were Phaethines. Like there were like these like little fairy people that had cricket bodies, and you know, like that's not something, when I immediately think about it, that you're gonna go in to just fight. There's gonna be some kind of trickery. So the question then is like, you know, are you clever? And it's gonna ask the three questions of the Fae, like the rule of etiquette, the rule of reciprocity, and you know, it's gonna be a different type of question that it's gonna pose, a challenge. But so it sounds like a monster is a personification, a living being that's going to present a question to the characters, like a challenge.
Yeah, but that challenge doesn't always have to be difficult. Like you said, goblins are usually this representation of a lower level threat, but you can go even lower, in my opinion. You can literally go and fight rats, or you can literally have one farmer that's worried about weevils on a single plant in his orchard, and
and that says something,
plant,
right? Like
yeah.
if you're fighting rats, then the classic is, if you're fighting rats, it's because you're kind of a loser. Like, no, I'm just kidding. No, you're like level 1.
You're
right?
in between
like,
employment options, all right?
It's like Bard's Tale. It's like, you know, you're in the tavern. It's like, well, go on down there and fight the rats, because, like, you know, and you're gonna get some copper pennies or whatever. Although I've always, before I even played Bard's Tale, I thought about, like, I think that may have been the first adventure in the Vale literally ever. It was literally the session right before you played in it, was they went into a cellar and there were magical rats and they drank magic potions, and so then they like spawned all these abilities and problems and stuff they had to deal with. But
How do you find the right monster for your game?
I suppose you answered that in that it should be the question that aligns with the adventure, the theme, or the characters. That could be an antagonist. It could be, the dragon goddess Tiamat, goddess of all chaos, or it could be Strahd, or at a lower level it could inform, hey, this is a rat, because at where you're at currently, a rat is a problem, or a goblin or something like that. So it should say something about the adventure and the characters. I will also say, so like 2 different levels, because I want to take this kind of a different direction if I can too. That I think you assume you're gonna put monsters in this, and it's gonna stand in the way of something that the players want, whether that's treasure or information or whatever. And they may negotiate with that monster, they may fight it, however they end up needing to deal with it. I think there's like 2 different approaches. One approach is like, hey, you need to prep a game. And to that, I'd introduce the concept of everything is a bear. Which is to say, and this is sort of like an old school Renaissance concept, that it's okay, in the modern RPG scene, they would call this reskinning. Mm-hmm. It's okay if you're prepping a game to just take a monster that fits that level. So if you're starting with a bunch of characters at level 1 and just like put some goblins in a cave, and that is fine, and that will. And there's another saying I like: you don't need to make it complicated, the players will. And a story will just start to spiral out of that. And last time we talked about like simplicity is elegance. It's not something, it's not condescending to say, hey, just start with some goblins. So that is a good thing to do. On the other hand, so on the opposite approach, and I see you do this all the time. Actually, you do this better than anybody I know. I don't know if this is just something like comes naturally for you, or if you like start with, okay, I have a goblin, like it's like a Mr. Potato Head, like every single monster is like, you're a Mr. Potato Head, I'm about to get crazy with you. I don't know I don't know if you start with that, or if you just already at this thing's crazy. I don't know how your mind works, but your monsters, Jake, are nuts. And that's something I strive for. So if you want a really interesting game, you say, how do you pick monsters for your game? There's a saying in Dungeon Crawl Classics, and I'll point out 2 games that do this mechanically and how. In Dungeon Crawl Classics, they say, make the monsters weird. And so the example I gave in Dungeon Crawl Classics, they did a level 1 adventure where they were traveling through a cursed forest, trying to negotiate with a dryad for an ancient dryad's wood, which could be used in a ritual. But the grove is inhabited by an avatar of the god Yggdrasil, the tree god. And the mutant sap of Yggdrasil seeps out into the ground, and it has infected a nearby tribe of orcs. And the orcs are no longer just orcs, but instead are like tree vine mutant orcs who have like tentacle vines like that, like come out of their body instead of arms. And of course that's really weird. That's like Dungeon Crawl Classics. But on the other hand, these are monsters, so they should be really weird and mythical. And so Dungeon Crawl Classics has a chapter on how to make monsters weird, and it gives you a bunch of tables. And you could use that for any game. And also Shadow Dark stole that. And Shadow Dark does it very simply. Like, I think it does it on like 1 page.
Yeah, use keywords, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really great. And there are a few games that do that, but I'll point out those 2. So those are 2 approaches. What monster do I pick? One is like, it's okay, everything's a bear, and that's fine. Especially on the fly. Just pick a monster, call it something else, reskin it, and base the armor class and hit points off what you need. The other approach is be really weird. And
Yeah.
yeah.
But I would actually argue that those could be the same thing too. If you have an idea about a monster and you have a question in mind, like what this monster needs to represent, and you don't have the time to generate stats that are equal or whatever, yeah, it's a bear, you're reskinning it. I wouldn't say that things need to be weird per se, but they need to be interesting or add to the question or add context to the story or add to the world itself. I think one of my favorite examples that I did of this was, I think you might remember this game, but we had to go investigate a distillery that was shut down, and it was in the middle of this bog, so like there's no communication to it, so we had to go there. Had the adventure party go to the bog, and then along the way there was like this pin of these kelpie creatures.
Yeah, I love that.
And the task was to collect the kelpies and put them back at their pin, and then the player characters would be rewarded with however much gold, considering how many they caught. The kelpies themselves, I don't remember what stats I used, but the stats were kind of irrelevant. The whole premise there was like, these kelpies exist here, they're a resource to the culture around them, and like the question was, can they catch them in time? Like that was the simple question. It was a simple premise, and it was a fun little mini game as like the intro to the adventure. And I think those are like the best times. So like you just have like this little thing as like this little taste before the actual adventure starts, and you can really make that adventure about anything. The fact that there were kelpies just added to that story of them being in a bog and like all the seaweed and stuff. But you could reskin it using the same stats. You could make that like beehives. Like one of my favorite adventures in playing Skyrim Elder Scrolls 5 was you actually have to go and burn all the apiaries for the honey brew mead. Like that was one of the funnest missions. It was like these poor bees getting burned to death, but like that could have been the same mission of like, can you burn all these apiaries in time? So like you can use the same question and change the monster, and change the skin of the monster or the appearance of the monster, the ethos of the monster, and it changes the context of the story, and it changes the feel and vibe of the story, and it changes the world around that monster.
One of my favorite campaigns of all time, and I will reveal now my favorite RPG of all time, and that's the Hero's Journey 2nd Edition, which I think I'm hoping to have James Spawn on to talk about, not just the Hero's Journey, but maybe some other things too. That's my favorite RPG, but it's also, we ran a campaign for about 9 months. And almost the entire premise of the campaign, they were on this journey. I called it Dollar General Lord of the Rings, because it was just like, yeah, they like had a magic sword. It was evil. They had to take it to the evil place to get rid of the evil thing. But really, what it was really about was the journey. And along the way, they had mythical fairy tale situations, like they found a wayfaring inn, and a troll would come by every night and attack it, and the inhabitants nearby would need to fend off the troll, sort of like Beowulf. And but as they investigated it and they went into the troll's cavern, they found a waterlogged bookshelf, which is a very odd thing to find in a troll's cave. And then they found a tiny little bed, which makes no sense for a big giant troll. And these things kind of breadcrumbed into finally discovering that this troll was trying to defend its fairy wife, and it had a curse on it, thanks to a troll slayer, supposedly, who was the innkeeper, and the innkeeper had reported to the local lord that it had slain the troll when he had not. And in truth, in this case, the troll was actually good. Like, it was a good person, and they actually came to, and what was even better is they came to reconcile the troll with the troll hunter. And yeah,
right.
and like the whole campaign was this subversion of fairy tale, because their original fairy tales, I got to read perhaps the first fairy tale to my daughter the other day, and I loved it. However, I had a bit of a problem with it. I have a fairy tale book, and the first fairy tale I ever read to her was The Princess and the Frog. And I started reading from the book, and I decided I didn't like the book. Because in the book, it kind of dovetails into the story of the Princess and the Frog, where the frog is a prince. But in the original story, maybe somebody will say I'm wrong, but this is my understanding. The original story is a warning to women about beings of chaos that live in the underworld. And many fairy tales are like that. They're very scary. They're very scary, and I like them. So that's like one approach. Is like when you start with that archetypal mythical monster, it is a thing of a child's nightmare. That's what I always say, is that a monster is, when we were children, what were we afraid of under the bed and what could it do? It's this really terrifying thing. But then alternately, like you're saying, you can subvert that, which is what Tolkien did, right? Because elves and dwarves are not necessarily in the Norse, like the prose and poetic Edda. They're not necessarily good things. Sometimes they're even malevolent, and Tolkien subverted that and made them sort of Christianized things, like the elves were almost like descended from angels, and the dwarves were these noble beings. So you can do that. You can take a monster and subvert it and make it something else too, and that's really cool.
Yeah, that kind of leads us into our next question, which is, what is a misconception about monsters? To which I would say that they have to be lethal, that they have to be bad. I think a good monster can be just as interesting as a bad monster. But what do you think? What is the biggest misconception you know about monsters?
One of the biggest revelations for me was the 2d6 reaction roll. When I came into like learning what I think is the masterpiece of Dungeons and Dragons, which is basic and expert Dungeons and Dragons, that suddenly that one thing opened up an entire world that was not there in games before. Like, I had to sort of imagine what a monster might do as a modern dungeon master, and then like you start with this assumption that if it's a kobold, it's a threat. And we had those situations where it didn't feel good. It didn't feel good to like suddenly be like, all right, well, we're fighting kobolds, and they're kind of weak and they're kind of pathetic actually. But you have this presumption where you're like, well, that's the starting presumption of it, and then maybe the dungeon master can kind of tweak that. But in basic and expert D&D and older versions of D&D, that was not the case at all. And the assumption was actually that you didn't really know what was going to happen. And in a way, I think that's much more mythical. Like, that is that kind of mythical monster, that it could come out and ask for something, or it could come out and give you something, or it may negotiate. The last monster in the wilderness in my Monday game, they always start at a sanctuary, and they always have to travel to the dungeon. They know where it is, but otherwise they would have to even find it. They always have to travel through the wilderness. And they encountered some trolls who actually were terrified of them. Now, they didn't know that. They only know that they saw shambling figures in the woods that seemed to like dart away. And then they decided not to pursue, But
Right.
It's a way more interesting living world, and you can accomplish that by rolling 2d6, and if it's 2 1s, they're coming to get you. But that is not mathematically very likely. And if it's a 12, they're going to actually try to wave you down, and in their weird alien monster language, they're going to try to talk to you. And they're like going to bow in service to you because they've heard of your exploits, and for some reason this troll thinks it can be a knight. And that's also not very likely, but it's in the cards.
Yeah, I think this is talking about a game where there's not a linear story. I think if you're trying to have a linear story, a table like this could really really dampen your mood. If you're like, they made it to this evil assistant's lair, and then they literally roll a 12 and like, oh, he loves you for some reason, and then that. Like if a bad GM or a DM would say, "Oh well, it doesn't. I'm gonna ignore the roll, and I'm gonna still make him super evil and still hate you guys, and he's gonna cast this spell because that's what he does." But a good GM is gonna be like, "Oh, why does he love you?" Like that question fuels the whole encounter of what is going on here. What is he into? What is he about? Like, why is this interest?
I want us to do
interest in you
like a
guys?
whole talk just about like context and what is it called? What's that thing in that book? Apophonia.
Oh yeah.
I want to do
yeah.
just like a whole talk on that, because I think that's the secret key to like being able to know what to do, is to say, so to use basic and expert D&D again, it has an encounter procedure, which the modern game did not have. So in the encounter procedure of basic and expert D&D, it gives you the reaction, so you could literally have a helpful monster. Now, it's interesting to have a helpful monster, as you said, in an open context. Like you just have like an open situation, and then you have a premise, like usually I'm here to try to get the treasure, but it could also be I'm here to rescue the farmer's daughter or whatever. But in that situation, you don't just have one type of monster. You have competing monsters that are fighting each other, or the trolls have like a whole barricade where they're trying to deal with the devolved wizard golems that have been left over from the ages from whence this was a wizard's tower and has since collapsed. And but they know that there is food there, so every once in a while the trolls like try to raid in and get that. And so you have all this stuff like we talked about last time we talked. These things you know about your world, where you just naturally know about your world. In the procedure, you do your reaction roll. You also determine how far away it is, which is huge. And I never thought about that, but that's huge, because if you're in a 30-foot room and the monster's 60 feet away, that means that you hear it in another room or down a hallway.
Right.
Or maybe it can only be appearing in a room with a bunch of other monsters, which means suddenly now all of a sudden you have all these context clues about why it's there, what's it doing, and that can be really interesting.
Right. In that same example, though, like if it's 60 feet away in a 30-foot room, but the room adjacent to it is flooded, then that monster is already drowned and he's
or
dead.
he's drowning.
So,
You hear gurgling noises or whatever. But that's all very interesting, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. This is like immediately it tells you like something that you didn't think. It's like the reaction rolls can just throw you a curveball and make it really interesting. They can also just tell you exactly what you expected to happen to, which is fine, because either way, it's the players had no idea that was what you intended, and it can be really like enjoyable to be caught off guard by those. I think. In addition to the reaction table, Shadow Dark also has the activity table.
Yeah.
Like not only what mood are they in, but like what are they actually doing right now? And one of the entries is fleeing from a worse monster.
That's great.
So like in the generation of one monster, now you have to stop and have an entire different monster. Like what else is down
We had
here?
a snowball one time where they started to fight a monster on horseback, so they were much faster, and the monsters fled. And then I rolled another encounter where those monsters ran into another group of monsters, and then those monsters fled, and then they ran into another group of monsters until like these now it made sense, believe me, but like these heroes at this point were on horseback with like a bunch of mercenaries they'd hired, and they were basically like the Rohirrim, and they were like charging across the field, and these monsters just kept snowballing into one another, and these monsters were enemies to one another, and now all of a sudden they're fleeing the heroes. And it was kind of goofy, but it was hilarious, and I didn't expect that. That was all something that just came out of those procedures.
See, in my mind, when you said monsters, all the monsters in that story were all goblins, and they're just riding horses through waves and waves of goblins. Like they're just piles, like dog piles of goblins everywhere that they drive through.
Yeah. I'm going to be boring, and I'm going to say misconception about monsters. And it is something you mentioned. Mechanically, maybe this is an opinion. High hit points are boring. But that's it depends on the game. But, we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons. But this is poor monster design. The modern monsters are very, very, very poorly designed because modern characters can usually take multiple actions, even if it's like a bonus action or a free action. They have multiple mechanical actions they can take, and comparable monsters do not have that. So what happens is monsters, I think about dragons, like modern dragons, not like the ones with legendary or lair actions, but like a regular dragon. If it doesn't have a special movement feature, sometimes you'll have a dragon that's just like a gigantic bag of hit points, is what I call it. Like it's just like tons of hit points. And what you end up with is what we call like surrounded pound, which I had happen multiple times, where you have a villain and they just surround it like a video game and just like hack it like it's World of Warcraft or something. And it's very uninteresting. Compare that to when I discovered the basic and expert dragon. And it had the weirdest feature where its dragon's breath was equivalent in damage automatically to its hit points. I was like, that is the weirdest and most gnarly thing. So like you could have this thing. First of all, you could hypothetically kill that dragon in like a couple of hits. So you could have this epic moment, which I've had happen, where a hero has a magic blade and they like, leap through the air and they're able to slice through the dragon's throat. And they do so much damage that like maybe it's one of those scenes where the gouts of flame erupts from the wound instead of from the mouth. And you can actually see the dragon weaken, and then the hero comes back around. And, that is just the thing to keep the hero alive if it must endure a dragon's breath. And then they come back around, they're able to slay the dragon. Alternately, that first dragon's breath is bad. So like it just feels very tense and epic, and it's very fast. And anyways, any monster is more interesting if it has an ability or can do really scary damage, as opposed to just having a bunch of hit points. Adding hit points does not make an interesting monster. That's a misconception.
Oh, and what also is equally unfun is a monster with just a really high AC, because then they're just missing all the time. Like if the monster's just hard to hit, that's not interesting. What I think is a good solution to that, if you want durability in a monster but you don't want just a big bag of hit points, is Hanker Infernal actually has a system he calls the chunks system, which is simply that you must meet a threshold to damage the monster. Alright, so the monster actually only has like 5 hit points. Okay, the monster has 5 hit points, but to remove a single hit point, you must do 10 damage in a single attack.
Yeah, that's great.
Or in a single round. And it's a very simple way to keep track of these larger numbers without having to actually get granular about it and just shove tokens around. What is it that Professor Dungeon Master says? It's like just pushing buttons around.
Yeah.
Like now you're just gonna have all these buttons over here. Yeah, no one wants to be pushing buttons.
Yeah, he stole that from Warhammer Fantasy, probably. In Warhammer Fantasy, you slide basically, and you enter a category, and it's like, all right, you're not gonna do anything unless you hit this threshold of damage. But then if you do this threshold of damage, you're gonna like lob his leg off, or you're gonna like, puncture an eye out or do something like that, so it's a very dynamic hit point system instead of static, like oof, 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 like a character in World of Warcraft or something.
I've also had, and this might be a spoiler, but I've also had a monster that had no hit points, and the only way to remove it was to please it in some way.
That's
I had
great.
a ghost that ghost was not going to leave.
Clyde the ghost
there was
dog?
no way to
Was it
defeat
Clyde?
No, Clyde, he just wanted to pet it. Like, if you would have pet it, he would have left you alone. But, like, no, like,
Clyde never
ghost
got what he
dogs are
wanted.
different than ghost people. But yeah,
Such
that's
cold-hearted people.
Yeah, but like to me, if your question cannot be solved with a sword or blade, then don't even worry about hit points.
I love that. Actually, that's fantastic.
Next question: what is your favorite monster and/or a memorable moment from a particular monster in a single game?
So, this maybe is not my favorite monster, but this is an example of how a monster can be really scary, and how it can act in ways that are very unexpected. And we've dealt with this recently in a game I'm in, and this was a time I've complained in the past that the modern game is not very exciting, it's not very challenging, and things like that. However, I ran a 5th level adventure one time. They were 5th level, and several of them died, including my wife's character, and they were like turned to ash. And in the modern game, a shadow is like it's like
a good one.
something like 1 CR or half CR. And it's similar even in the original game, in original Dungeons and Dragons. It's not. I think it maybe has 3 hit dice, which is pretty scary. But what it does is it drains your strength, which is horrifying. And then I think if you go to 0 strength, you not only die, but you rise again as a shadow in like D3 days or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but I have had that come up. That monster. First of all, I never just say a shadow appears. Never ever. And note, I try not to do that with any monster. So in my old school, like my original D&D retro clone Swords and Wizardry, the game I run on Mondays, if they have encountered a troll, it's a hulking, slouching thing with unusually long arms and claws that it drags along below its knees, and it looks like it's covered in moss. So they've
never name the monster. That's
they've come to call them the Moss Men, and then
that's even better than troll.
Yeah.
I like that better than troll.
And they even say that those are Moss Men. We see Moss Men or whatever they like call them that, and then they did that with hobgoblins. Hobgoblins were like these sort of semi-mutated. Their features were alien looking. They just weren't right. Their skin pigmentation didn't line up with anything they had seen before. Some of their features looked stretched and elongated. Their eyes looked alien. But they always seemed to have weapons and armor. Always. And so they came to call them the Chaos Men. Because because they would march in like formations and attack the villages and just slaughter people. And they were horribly evil. So they called them the Chaos Men, and they had this war against the Chaos Men. And
I would have called them the Muty Cuties, but that's
Muty
okay.
Cuties. Yeah, they were indeed not cute, as a matter of fact. But
It doesn't sound like it.
yeah, and anyways, shadows. So I never just say you know there's a shadow. Instead, I would always anytime I present a shadow, anytime at all, I always present the character in a situation doing something. So like the last time a shadow appeared, they were in a dungeon, and imagine like if you ever go caving or you're ever in a basement with the lights off and a door closed, lights do really weird things, like lights and shadows, and it's suffocating. It feels wrong. Literally your inner ear tells you, hey, I'm not supposed to be beneath the earth. Something's going wrong here. So
Right.
you begin to like have this sense, your proprioceptors start to kind of stand up, and you're like, what's going on? So I play with that, and I say, because they said they were searching a wall, okay? So I said, all right, you're searching along the wall, and meanwhile you can see your shadow behind you also searching the wall. The shape elongates as Father Bloombat, who's this other character, he walks behind you. You can hear the clanking of the metal on his lantern as he's walking behind you. The shadow, it moves as Father Bloombat moves. All the shadows move around, but suddenly, while all the other shadows are moving, yours collapses and becomes small and stands separate from the other shadows. It puts its hands on its hips and wags its finger at you. and you feel something claw into your flesh, or something, whatever it is.
Oof.
Whatever it
Yeah.
is, like it's not just a shadow. Your shadow is doing something that it should not be doing right now, and it should make you
Right.
really uncomfortable. Because if your shadow
Yeah.
does something like literally right now, like if my shadow did something like started moving and waving at me or something, I'd be like, I would flip this table over. I think
Right. Yeah.
shadows. That's
I
my
agree.
that's one of my favorites, I guess.
I somehow inherently knew that.
No kidding.
I like if I could, as I asked the question, I was like, hey, what monster would you run forever if you could run one monster and only one monster? And immediately I thought of the encounter that whenever I first encountered a shadow in your game, we came across this caravan of what looked like mercenaries that had all been slaughtered on the ground. And as we approached, their shadows reached up from their corpses and began to attack us. And the feeling of not having to not having to worry about your hit points because it's just your strength, and then realizing that your strength is your dump stat and you actually have less strength than you would have if you had hit points, and this feeling that they could actually take you down in one turn.
Yeah, terrifying. Okay, well, what's your favorite monster?
Oh, that's so hard. It's funny is I tease you for not having to answer this, but I don't think I had an answer picked out either.
It's goblins. Come on. I mean, it's goblins.
Goblins are so good, but the thing is,
It's
I
so
feel
goblins.
goblins can be stagnant though. I would say it's some goblin alternative. I think right now, especially after tonight's game, I'm really high on bullywugs. Like these little amphibian things.
They're great.
Those are where it's at.
They're really great. I do like bullywugs a lot. No, I'm thinking of
although
Kuatoa, actually, is the ones I'm thinking of.
Kuatoa are also
I
fun,
use
yeah.
those little weirdos a lot. Like, they're so weird. But, yeah, bullywugs, frogs in general. What are they called? Grigs? Or, the little frog dudes?
Grex? No, Grex are the worm things, the beaks. I don't remember what they're called. But yeah, definitely little amphibian things. Just this idea of muddy creatures, just
great.
mud creatures. You have moss creatures, I have mud creatures.
I love it. That's such a good one too. I'm gonna steal it for my number 2. We had so Dungeon Crawl Classics, they have a god called Bugbabills, and he's the frog god of swamps and snot and stuff like that. And when you're
all the
yes,
necessities.
the good things in life, as they say. And anyways, if you're a cleric of Bugbabills, you start to turn into a frog and stuff. It's so good. And my players in the Dungeon Crawl Classics campaign, I don't think they really cared about the ending, and neither did I. The ending was just being goofy. It was this headless chaos titan that was destroying the world, and by the time you're 10th level in Dungeon Crawl Classics, you're flying around as a superhero and zapping things and stuff, and so they were doing that, and it was just being goofy. But the real high point, I think, for us was the Croaking Thane, which is an adventure I recommend, and also a very simple dungeon. It's a dungeon about frogs, man. About demon frogs, and but don't do it if you don't like body horror. I'm talking people listening, if you don't like body horror, don't check out the Croaking Thane. But if you like weird frogs, it's about it's about 2 frog cults that are at war with each other. So my players called it Toad War 3. Well, that's what they ended up calling the campaign. Yes, frogs. Gosh, frogs. It's so good. Okay.
Lastly, I was going to ask you, what's a good tip for new DMs when writing monsters?
What's a good tip for new dungeon masters on running monsters in a game?
I mean, you said you want to use the procedures. If you don't have a monster prepared, and you don't have stats readily available, anything can be a bear. You don't need to worry about it. I think something that for me to keep in mind is the morale check.
Oh,
A
yeah.
morale check, and not all games have this, but most do. And the one game this became crucial in was when I ran Pirate Borg. the morale system in Pirate Borg is really great, but even like the most lethal monsters, they automatically pass morale
Right.
checks and stuff like that. But the morale check is often forgotten in modern games as it becomes like the slaughter fest and we kill every last goblin, and you wait till every last hit point is gone. But a morale check can just save you 20 minutes of doing that. It could, if the conflict is already resolved and it's just a matter of hit points, then go ahead and resolve the conflict. But what happens if even before the conflict's resolved, all of a sudden they fail a morale check and start to retreat? What does that look like? Are they retreating because they have traps down that hallway? What is this? It reinforms the premise, and reinforms the question that the whole encounter, and it really tells a story, and it tells a larger story about the world around it. And I forget to do it, so that's my tip to new DMs: is don't forget about morale.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, I've got one here. This is especially as so I've talked to Jim Parkin recently, and we talked about the Free Kriegspiel Renaissance and sort of like being a little more open-ended in how you approach games, focusing more on choices and actions and the exchange of information. Communication is agency. Agency is the game. Constantly communicating things that are going on. If something seems unclear, don't bury the lead. Make it clear. If they look confused, if something's ambiguous, pull things down and make it just a series of choices. You can do A or B. Like communication. And along those lines, while I was running old school Renaissance games for about the first year, I had about a 40% casualty rate. And I mean per session. And that is because the players did this, where they would run into combat and I hit it with my sword. And I facilitated that. And I eventually got to a point, this was like a point where things really changed for me. In Old School Essentials or Basic and Expert D&D, in the procedures at the top of the round it says declare spells. And I learned to call that declare spells, actions, plans, hijinks, stunts, and schemes. And that's the most important thing. Like, never mind, I move over here and I do this, and I've become increasingly disinterested in I want to do this with my character. I'm much more interested in, like, what does the group want to do? And I find that much, I mean that as a player. Like, as a player, I find it much more interesting to work with characters and do things. And isn't that true even in video games? Isn't it more interesting to try to, like, stack things together with other people you're playing with than to just, all right, I'm just waiting on my turn? And isn't that one of the most boring things that we all knew about the modern game when we played it in the past, where you're like, I'm just waiting over here to activate my abilities and do my cool thing? And for many people, they're just like zone out. So instead of, and of course the real answer to that is certainly be a fan of the other characters. But another solution to that is, like, what if from the get-go it was actually about what is the group going to do? And as soon as I introduced that, there was a slime monster attacking a village in that very session. And instead of I run up and hit it with my sword, they began to experiment with what I've heard called tactical infinity. Which is to say, if you can think of it and it makes sense, you can do it. Mm-hmm. And so they were like, all right, I'm in a village. Is there like a wagon nearby and I could like set it on fire and ram it into the slime? Yes, you can. There's a wagon over there. Right. It's got hay on it. One of you I'm going to say it's going to take 2 of your turns though. Like, all right, one of you sets it on fire. It takes one of your torches. All right, the other, you push it together. Bam, you slam it in there. And the other thing about tactical infinity is diegesis. So if something would happen in the fiction, that's what would happen. Now this one's a little more spicy, I guess, but that's more important than hit points. That's like a secret I've learned. Now what I mean by that is not that hit points don't matter, but rather like you don't just change the hit points as a dial to be like, oh well, I'm gonna dial it up and make it more fun, or I think it'd be more fun if I like dialed the hit points down. People aren't stupid like that. I can tell if somebody's doing that.
Right.
Hit points are fun because they're a challenge, because they're there, and it's challenging, it's threatening. So to change it like that makes them meaningless. You should just not have hit points if that's the case. Instead, diegesis works like this. If you can sneak up behind someone and it's a human being, it's not a vampire lord or the undead or a demon or something. If it's a human being and you can sneak up behind them and you can slit their throat, they just die. So like, for example, we did that in Mutineer Zero this week. Sean has a character who's like an assassin, and she cracked this big plot about how she was going to take down 3 people. Well, she did it, and like the requisite roll occurred. So we didn't roll for like initiative. Well, you still have to roll for initiative. Well, you do this, you do that. No. It just happened, and like, bam, you assassinated them. And that was way more satisfying because it was her making choices instead of like, being bound to that rule. I don't know if that makes any sense, but to me, that's a thing on running monsters that I think I'm increasingly caring more about is they should be bound to the world, not necessarily to just the rules whenever that gets in the way.
Yeah, this is like a setting over system kind of situation. I think that happens in all of my games to a certain extent, and actually I think this is one of the reasons I think a lot of my games fail is everything is set in world. So something as simple as talking to the wizard, you have to go through all this bureaucracy of talking to the crow familiar, and then you have to go and talk to the gnome apprentice, and you have to wait, and all this diegesis that actually doesn't really help it. But I mean, I guess it makes you have that same feeling of like, I don't want to be here anymore. Like, I hate waiting on this guy, and I'm in this situation of bureaucracy, and it's very uncomfortable. And like, it's like waiting in line at the DMV, and maybe that adds to it, but it also is not interesting. So maybe that shouldn't be the case.
I had that problem in Traveler, and I blame the adventure module in part. There were a few things that were kind of, that made it challenging, but nonetheless, there's this adventure module, and if people know Traveler, they probably know the one I'm talking about. Where basically you're just getting a starship out of a volcano, and the adventure module literally could have been that sentence. But instead, there are about 4 or 5 pages of dealing with the local bureaucracy. After you land, it says you have to wait several hours while you try to go through customs and stuff. And I was flabbergasted. Like I don't know, and I don't know why. I was loyal to that format, but I got into it, and then all of us realized we were like, man, this is shoe leather. This actually, there's nothing actually happening. Like, there are no choices. There's nothing actually happening. Right. But a difference would be, I think a good delineation there is, are the players able to make choices? And are those choices meaningful? So like an opposite example of that happened in Traveler recently that, is not in the rules, and it sort of violates or overruled the combat rules because it made sense to me, and I don't care. I was like, this makes sense. And they landed at a starport, and they got caught up in a gun battle where some local militants were trying to assassinate a noble. And they got caught up in this, and they decided they were going to be big damn heroes. Like, this was a moment where they were like, no, we're going to try to get involved. So they bring out their weapons. Weapons were allowed on that world. They start firing back, but one of the players is like, hey, back on that world where there was the volcano where I tried to get the ship out, I bought a fishnet. Can I throw this fishnet on him and just like make it to where it's harder for him to do stuff? And I'm like, yeah. There's no rule in Traveler for throwing a fishnet on someone and tangling them up in it.
Right.
And honestly, it's better to say, if it makes sense at all, either you should say no, that doesn't make sense, and then provide other options, in my opinion, or you should say yes, and it just happens. It just happens.
Right.
And that's
I'm gonna say,
because
if the
that's an
procedure was
option and a
there-
choice, and he had a creative idea. So if it is an option, and it is a choice, and it's a meaningful choice, and it is a creative idea, you should just allow it to happen. Anyways.
All right, I would just add to that even if there was a procedure for net throwing in Traveler, if it's that well of a thought out plan and everything, maybe it still just happens.
That's
Now,
true too.
I've gone on this train of like, I don't think you need to have everything follow the rules of the game as far as like procedures and as far as like actually like roll to hit or anything like that. If you just, like you said, if you sneak up behind the human, you got them. Like there's nothing they could do about it. If you take the proper protocols or think about the world as it really is, and you come up with this, you answer the question, then you've answered the question. You don't need to roll dice. You don't need to.
Yeah, that kind of loops
test-
it back.
test the
Like if a
system.
monster poses a question and you answer that question, that works, whatever that is.
Yep.
And that's maybe departing a bit from the tactical grid of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, there are people of note that enjoy either the classical style of play. They're a bit on the side of wargaming, and that is absolutely a valid gameplay style. And I'm not criticizing it. But I am talking about maybe a more free-form, narrative, emergent narrative style of play, where that's the goal. So what I'm talking about does not satisfy maybe that wargame approach, okay? But, you know, setting the wargaming or classical style, or even modern players, because I think the modern edition is actually very good at wargaming. Setting that aside, you can exit the paradigm of hit points when it makes sense. When it makes sense, but don't arbitrarily do it. Like, don't try to create an illusion of hit points. Like, oh, well, actually, that just kills it, and you change the hit point. If you're changing the hit points on the spot, you should just not have hit points, because they don't mean anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And smart players can tell if they're fighting a monster. They can tell if you suddenly just dial down the hit points. Like they're
Or dialed it up,
Yeah.
like
That's it. Oh
three
gosh, that's
goblins
even
die
worse.
in the first
Oh,
hit,
no.
and then the last goblin is taking 12 hits, and you're like, why is this goblin not
Oh,
dying
jeez.
yet?
Or it's like one of those video game modes where it's like, well, this is actually my final form, and then it like changes into something. Now, if that's planned, that can be fun. That can actually be an interesting tactic. But yeah, no monster dials, in my opinion. At least not on the spot. Now,
Right. I would preface this with all the way up until the first like initiative is rolled, that monster stat is up for grabs. You know what I mean? Like we said that.
because if
anything could
something
be
in the
a
world makes
bear.
sense, yeah, because the world is more
Right.
important. Yeah, if something's going on, it
Yeah,
makes
so
sense.
if you can take that bear and say, actually, this is a centipede, and it's going to have this hard carapace on it that's hard to hit. So instead of this AC, we're gonna bump that AC a little bit. Or this is actually like a really slow creature, so I'm gonna lower that AC, or I'm gonna raise this or whatever. All the way up until that initiative point's been rolled, I feel like that is up for grabs. But once the initiative's been rolled, you got what you got, and I think staying true to it makes a more interesting game for everybody. Because that tension is built through combat and or conflict. It doesn't even have to be combat necessarily, I guess, but like that tension is built over that encounter, and then until the encounter is resolved, changing that at all is not playing the game. It's telling the story that you wanted
Right.
to tell and not playing the game.
Yeah,
that way.
and to clarify, because I think some people that listen to this, they'll also know, like, so there is also a school of design where you don't design encounters, you design a world, and so
yeah.
if you have that approach where you're like, this place over here has a centipede in it, then yeah, of course, then the initiative then is not the benchmark for that. It's got a centipede over there, and you've already decided that, so you be honest. But if you have an approach to adventures where that's not your approach, then it makes sense, like to try to present an honest world as it comes up. So yeah, you could say, well, this just doesn't make sense, and you change it. But once you're actually hitting something, if you're just changing the hit points on the fly, especially to dial it up, that's like infamous. But I think some people think it's okay to dial it down, and the only exception to that, I would say, is once again diegesis. It's what's happening in the fiction, where if like something takes some huge hit, or if it doesn't make any sense, sometimes a monster having some carryover hit points just doesn't make any sense. I don't know if so let's say you're in a combat and somebody does this big area of effect thing, and yeah, I don't know. Maybe that sounds obvious.
It takes out 13 skeletons, but leaves one.
And it makes no
point.
sense, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So and it adds absolutely nothing whatsoever. It's just like blind loyalty then to that math. The world is the truth. Yeah. So whatever that fictional world is.
Right. I mean, it's all about the type of game you want to play, though.
That's
right?
true too.
Just because our personal opinion of what's interesting doesn't mean that's the right way to play. If you like the tactical about it, and your table agrees that the fact that he has one,
I think we're like talking about a
important
certain
for whatever-
kind of like game and gameplay
Right.
style here. Yeah, certainly. Because I agree. Yeah, that people that want a more tactical game and having that hanging skeleton where he's like, I made it, and you're gonna have like 12
Yeah,
guys.
and then he retreats and reports on
Actually,
it.
now that's interesting. Yeah, maybe that's reading the world, and maybe that's what the world has to say about it. That maybe he makes it out of there. I don't know. But once again, thanks a lot, Jake, talking about monsters and hanging out and talking about tabletop role-playing games. I appreciate you hanging out with me and chatting about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love it here at the Cozy Crow. I do hope that you muster the courage to go face that troll.
Yeah.
I think
Don't
you could
judge
really
me.
use the coin. Thanks.
Mythic Mountains RPG is a private online play club that focuses on folk RPGs. Folk RPGs are the games that belong to all of us. They're what actually happens at a table between friends. It's their voice that has the authority on what is fun and what works for them. Weekly, we upload our games to allow others to sit in with us. The channel isn't monetized. We don't own the artwork, music, software, or games shown in these actual plays, and you can find links to their authors in the description. Like, subscribe, and share if you wish, or don't. Just like games in person, you're welcome to pull up a chair, sit in, and watch some of our games. No performances, no fancy equipment, just regular people playing folk pencil and paper role-playing games and having a good time. We hope these games will prove a source of enjoyment to anyone just wanting to listen in, anyone looking for examples of how actual groups run and play folk RPGs, and most importantly, if you haven't found your group yet, you're welcome here at ours.